Welcome to the Startup Grind.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our friend, Tim Hwang. All right. Thank you, Tim. I heard you just got back from a 9-hour retreat just now. I mean, literally just now.
Yeah. It was like an hour ago that ended.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess like you don't have much energy to.
No, I totally have a bunch of energy.
You got it?
So,
Okay,
yeah,
good.
I'm good.
Cool. Awesome. But so we always like to start our Startup Grind interview with more of a personal note. So I know that you're children of immigrants from Korea. So let's talk about like where you're born, where you're raised, what did your parents do, and then perhaps talk about your first entrepreneur experience as a child, which probably wasn't that long ago, right? So let's talk about that.
Sure. So my parents are from South Korea, and I was born in Michigan. My parents moved here to the DC area probably when I was 3 or 4 years old. Both of them worked for the federal government. My mother worked for a variety of different art museums here around town, and my father worked for NIH as a researcher. So very traditional family, I guess, in suburban Maryland that I grew up. I went to elementary, middle school, and high school in suburban Maryland, around in Rockville, and kind of grew up, just like every other kid. Probably, I think the first entrepreneurial experience that I had was when I was, I think it was like 4 or 5. Back then there were these things that were like, Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh were super popular back then, and so there was this kind of underground market that was developing in trading Pokemon cards. So what I would do is I would actually import Pokemon cards from outside the country, like these super rare
4-year-old importing.
Yeah, it was like 4 or 5. It was like first grade, I guess. And so there was this kind of arbitrage opportunity you could make, right? So you had kids who would have like little allowances, and then so I'd import the cards, kind of split them up, and so you'd import like a pack for $10, and you'd sell each card for like 50 cents, and so I'd walk away with like $20, which is actually a pretty interesting entrepreneurial experience.
$20 as a first grader.
Yeah, it wasn't that bad.
That's funny. The thing is that my parents immigrated from South Korea as well, and I just find it very intriguing. Before we get into the FiscalNote story, your parents are always trying to look for the best for the children. When you first started FiscalNotes, you had all the accolades, graduating from Princeton, and then your Harvard MBA. How did your parents react when you said, "Mom, Dad, not going through Harvard anymore"? What was that? Was that sort of heartbreaking?
Yeah.
So for your parents?
It's actually I have a funny story around this as well. So after we raised our first round of venture capital, obviously it was like a big uphill battle just getting them to get in line with the idea that I was starting a company. But after we raised our first round of capital, obviously it's kind of like a big milestone, right? Like you really kind of institutionalize the company, you're growing the company. And my mother actually really wanted me to go to law school, right? So she was basically, we raised the round of capital and we were growing the company. We had 15 employees at the time, continued to grow. There was this strong trajectory of growth. And then I was on the phone with my mom, and she said, I was telling my mom about all these great things that were going on, and she said, "Okay, well that's really great, honey. When are you going to go back to law school?" Because I think she still had it kind of in her mind that you really want to get back on like the stable career path and everything. So I think they're a little bit more in line with what we're doing now, but occasionally I do get the question. Less so from my parents, but definitely from my relatives.
Do you think that your parents are going to ask you, like after you get your IPO and billions, do you think they're going to still ask you to go back to Harvard and graduate?
Oh, definitely.
They were? Okay, that's what I thought. Hashtag Startup Grind at Tim T. Hwang. Tim Hwang. Okay, please tweet out, because if you do, we'll give a free T-shirt to I think so. Don't quote me on that. So let's go. Let's go to the FiscalNote story. Before you started FiscalNote, you had some experience, right? You were elected into office, right? At the age of, I don't know, 19?
17.
17, wow,
Yeah.
okay, great. You got elected. Let's talk about that experience first before we go into FiscalNotes. Like, what did you learn from that whole experience of, you founded National Youth Association, so I call it, and that was millions of people, right? That signed up. So let's talk about the experience. How did that help you finally, start the, FiscalNote?
Sure. So I had, a couple of interesting experiences back when I was a little younger. So when I was 16, I had the great opportunity to work on President Obama's campaign, which was actually a really great experience. So for anybody that kind of straddles this world between politics and campaigns and startups, I think one of the interesting kind of perspectives that I thought was, being and working in a political campaign is actually one of the fastest growing startups you can work in, right? So in the example of the Obama campaign, you had 11 months, build out a 50-state network, staff in all 50 states, managing hundreds of millions of dollars, managing the culture, the operations, everything, as quickly as possible. So, there are definitely experiences back when, in like Virginia where, we'd be sleeping on like church pews because we didn't have an office yet for kind of setting that up or anything. So, pizza boxes and really, really late nights on Google Docs is kind of the startup experience, but that really characterized that experience for me. So after the campaign ended, had an opportunity to kind of serve on the Montgomery County Board of Education, which, for a 17-year-old was actually very fascinating work, right? Because, you're effectively, helping to run this kind of massive organization. It was a $2.3 billion operating budget, a $1.2 billion capital budget for 23,000 public employees. Fascinating experience kind of being at the top level of, running strategy, running operations, learning about talent and development. And then there's this added bonus, of being there in 2009 when the tax receipts fell straight off a cliff. And so a lot of kind of litigation, a lot of dealing with governments as you're trying to transition the government during that time out of this very, very stressful period, and gives you a really strong appreciation for the really tough decisions that have to get made. But also, I think that's really where I started to get this kind of inkling of why is the system so inefficient, right? So when I was on the Board of Education, and for anybody that knows, education is one of those industries where there's just a crushing amount of regulation across every single level, right? So you have local ordinances, you have state regulations, you have the federal government, pouring down laws and regulations onto you. And so how does your traditional school board deal with that type of issue, right? It's not that different from any other organization. You go off and you hire a ton of attorneys, a ton of lobbyists that sit there and read through the information and try and make sense of the crushing amount of regulations that come out. And so I thought this was incredibly inefficient. One example of this was, at the time, the Maryland state government was trying to pass a bunch of new regulations around, legislation around, curriculum changes, financial literacy, whatever the case is. And our approach was, okay, let's hire 2 full-time lobbyists that are going to sit there in Annapolis and follow everything and report back to us. So given the way the board was structured, we would actually get information every couple of weeks. And so by the time you got the information, it was already too late to do anything about it, right? I mean, it was pretty insane that, being only an hour away, Rockville and Annapolis, that you still had just weeks and weeks of information that it would take to kind of get out. So kind of reflected on that, was thinking about going
This is still in college though, right?
Well, so this is actually in high school.
Oh, it's okay. Sorry.
Yeah, so I was thinking about going down the political path, and decided I was pretty young at the time. I was still a teenager, and really wanted to go back and learn some hard skills. So decided to go to Princeton, studied this kind of intersection between computer science and public policy at the Woodrow Wilson School, and really got kind of a really academic experience and thinking about policy, thinking about the actual tools to use, and I was lucky enough such that the end of my sophomore year, beginning of my junior year, I was asked by a couple of ex-Obama alums and whatnot to start this organization to kind of try and really institutionalize the youth voice in Washington. And so we were trying to start this organization called the National Youth Association, which was effectively sort of like the center-left grassroots organization that was advocating on behalf of the 18 to kind of 34 demographic here in Washington. So a lot of work, obviously, in immigration reform, implementation of ACA, around Pell Grant funding and whatnot. And one of the biggest things you realize very quickly is that even if you're here in Washington, you don't really know what's going on, in Capitol Hill or in different departments or anything. So my approach was very traditional in the sense that I had a bunch of interns, bunch of analysts sitting there kind of reading through information, assembling reports, and so that we could kind of go back and react to things. Now, the interesting dynamic at the time was that Congress obviously is shutting down effectively at this time. And what's happening at that point is, you have a lot of governance moving to the state and local levels, right? So Congress isn't going to do anything around immigration reform, so states start picking up issues around like DREAM Act and those types of things, right? Congress isn't going to do anything about some of the fiscal matters, and so that's getting pushed down way down to the state and local level. So effectively what's happened is you have a splintering of information, and it becomes much more apparent to you that it was harder and harder to collect this information. And so I think I kind of looked at the problem. I said, this is a really stupid problem, right? All these, these kids sitting here like punching in refresh on Google, trying to get information out of governments, when effectively it's a search engine problem, right? At the end of my junior year at Princeton, thought, okay, well, what if we effectively created a search engine for law, right?
This is still at National Youth Association, right?
Right.
So
right.
you're running this, and then there's this huge, almost like Mechanical Turks, like getting a bunch of interns and just basically acting like machines and searching for information, right?
Right.
And so now we're getting to the aha moment for FiscalNote, right? This is where you thought, hey, this is going to be a great idea. Now at this point, you could have just still run with the National Youth Association versus starting a new company. So tell us the thought process of you deciding to branch off and now creating a startup. Yeah,
so the NYA effectively was a 501c4 political action committee attached to it. It was a very political organization. And I thought about it, and it turned out that I felt like technology could really be incredibly disruptive in this space. The other thing was that I had a lot of friends that were facing similar issues around Washington, right? So if any of you have ever worked in a federal agency or whatnot, there's a massive, governmental affairs or legislative affairs office or regulatory affairs office that deals with, very stupidly, what everybody else is doing, around your agency. So you effectively have a large percentage of people trying to keep tabs on what everybody else is doing in Washington. And so if you think about it, if you're working at the White House, if you're working at AFL-CIO, if you're working at Sierra Club or any major corporation that has a general counsel office, there's a very large, I think, commercial opportunity, and that was kind of the aha moment in that respect.
So I'm still trying to wrap this thing around my head. I know you just explained to me what the problem was, and I sort of consumed it. I'm trying to chew on it. But how did you get Mark Cuban to get excited about this? I mean, I think this is what surprises everyone here. You got a very boring industry. I mean, I'm sorry, no offense to you. I mean, I'm just saying this is a very like not boring, like not as fun industry. And then you got someone like Mark Cuban who got real excited about how you're disrupting it. So, what did you say? Like, what was that pitch? What did that pitch email sound like? Because Mark Cuban doesn't invest in he doesn't invest in any startup, let alone FiscalNotes, right? I mean, I'm just saying, like, how did you get him to invest in you guys?
Yeah. So, the email that I cold emailed Mark Cuban, and that's pretty much how I got him to really start off that process. But in thinking back to that cold email, it was pretty much we have this incredible team that we built. I had incredible co-founders, insanely smart. Some first employees that had worked at NASA and at Sprint and a couple others. And we were applying very hardcore technology, right? It wasn't just like we're going to slap a web application together, on top of like the search engine. It was like at that point when we were pitching him, we had really built out, like natural language parsers and had come out with this sort of forecasting algorithm that was capable of predicting with high levels of accuracy whether or not a bill would pass. So, in kind of pushing the boundaries of technology, I think, the two things that he was excited about, number one was, the team that we had assembled. And then number two, the problem that we were solving and the way that we were solving it, right? It wasn't just like, we were starting a consulting firm or something, right? It was, we were actually pushing the boundaries of technology to be able to solve this like very old and stodgy problem that not a lot of people had seen. I think that's fundamentally kind of what drove the initial interest.
Okay. So how did you get his email?
Well, I Googled it. So, I mean, I think his email is publicly available or something. But the interesting thing is, we cold emailed him, and he responded within like 40 minutes. So
How long was the email, anyways? What did it say? Can we have copies of it so we can just interchange it with our own startups?
I think it was like 5 lines, so it was a pretty short email. But yeah, so there's an interesting story behind this because I was in Chicago pitching an investor at the time, and I had my co-founders who were actually back in the Valley, and they were eating dinner and about to go watch a movie. They had like purchased their movie tickets and everything, and so I shoot an email to Mark Cuban. He responds back. He's like, "Sounds really interesting. Send me more information." And we get like this entire list of things we need to send back. And so I call them. It's like a Friday night at like 7:30 at night. They're about to walk into the movie theaters. Like, get out of the movie theaters. I don't care what you're eating. Go back to the office and finish this pitch deck or whatever. And so they grudgingly they walk back to the office.
What movie was it?
I think it was Wolverine. So, so to this day they haven't seen that movie. But they.
You owe him a DVD copy, by the way.
Yeah, I do. But yeah, I mean, we worked around the weekend to get that deal done and got it done.
Okay, so this next story that I find this very fascinating. You guys were in the Valley, right? And you guys were camped out at a Motel 6 because you couldn't find office space anywhere else. So you went to a Motel 6, coded for a couple of months, and then that was when Mark Cuban responded to you guys, and then you guys decided to come back here in DC. So people must have thought you were crazy to come back here, after getting money in the Valley, and then coming back here. Like, what were people thinking? I mean, what sort of like feedback were you getting from people?
Yeah. So the interesting thing is that we actually didn't move to DC yet. We were actually in Bethesda when we moved back, so it was kind of even further removed from the district and from the Valley. So there's a lot of reasons that we moved into the district. I think number one reason was that our customer base is here, right? So we were seeing that a lot of our customers were government affairs, compliance folks, general counsel folks that are based here in Washington, and so there's a lot of benefit from just being so close to your customers, being able to walk to them, host them at your offices, hold joint events or whatnot. So there was that. The other thing was that I had sort of this gut feeling that the culture in the Valley was becoming a little bit more toxic. And toxic is probably too strong of a word, but it was probably just wasn't conducive to building like a long-term culture at a company. So this is this is kind of the end of 2013, beginning of 2014, and you saw a lot of like very mercenary type culture in the Valley. So like the average lifespan of an engineer at like a Valley tech firm was very, very short. You didn't see a lot of like very talented enterprise sales folks that wanted to stay for a very long time and stick to it. So there was that kind of issue. The other issue was just I think the reason why we chose Bethesda over the district initially was that I was a little bit afraid that when the company was so small that the company culture would be subjected to kind of this like very strict 9:30 to 4:30 type culture that kind of permeates through a lot of Washington. And so that's why we chose Bethesda initially, was because we wanted to choose an isolated enough location where we could grow a very small team, build a very strong culture, and then move into the district where we could have a larger presence in the city. So
I didn't even know there was a difference between Bethesda and DC, but that's a really good observation.
Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to let's get more because I think the reason why folks are really interested in hearing your story is because you're really close. I mean, you're here, and yet you were able to do these amazing things in such a short period of time. So, can you talk about when you first created I know this whole lean startup thing, but like when you first created your prototype, your MVP, what did that look like? How did you finally, it's basically the aha moment. Like somebody said, I want to buy this, and then that's when you realize, oh my gosh, we have a company here. Let's talk about that. Like, what was sort of your first prototype? What did that look like?
Yeah, so it's not anything magical. Like it was very, very, I mean, it was just all hustle at that point, right? So, if you can kind of paint the picture at this time, we were in the Motel 6. There were 5 guys, 2 beds, so we had 1 guy sleeping on the floor for about 3 months, and coding and calling and all these different things. So one of the things that I was doing along with one of my other co-founders was essentially we made a Google Doc of I think it was like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of general counsel offices, and we would just spend weeks just calling people like all day, right? And we had a script of questions like, are you facing this problem? Do you have this problem? Do you feel like this type of solution would solve it?
Where did you find those, like, those I mean, they're actually phone numbers.
Right.
So you went to the white pages and found those phone numbers?
So we were going on like Hoover's, and we were going like searching things on people's contact page. I mean, we just made
But there's no email. It's just all like calling them.
Right.
Wow. Okay. So go on.
So it was basically like us dialing and trying to grab at as many data points as possible of like whether or not there was a pain point and whether or not we could solve it through the specific solution that we were building. So, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, we thought about pivoting a lot. I mean, it's interesting. I think looking back now, 2 years, that we actually to this day have not pivoted the idea at all. But we're just trying to validate it as quickly as possible, right? And so I think at a certain point we had hit like 60 or 70 customer calls that we had done, and it's kind of our version of just doing basic market discovery. And at that point, I think we had come upon and validated the need for the product in the market.
So how many questions did you have? So what did it look like? Like, just, do you have a copy of it, by the way? No? What does it look like?
I still think
curious.
we do have a copy on it somewhere in Google Docs.
So like, what was the questions, and then like how many questions did you have, and what was the last question? I'm kind of curious about that one.
I think the last question was, would you want to buy it from us or something like that?
I knew it. See. So like, okay, so step us through that, because I mean, this is really valuable information here. You cold call them, you ask them, this is who I am.
Right.
This is our value proposition, or do you start asking like, how do you do this, how do you do that, and sort of like get them in a little position until the cat's in the corner, and he's like, okay, would you buy this? And you'll give them your value proposition. Is that?
Yeah, well, it was a lot of iteration, right? Like, I mean, it wasn't like we changed the questions constantly throughout the entire process. So I don't remember the exact questions, but it was something like, hi, we're a tech company based here in the Valley. We're one of the only ones solving this legal and policy problem. We found that a lot of other customers are facing this problem. Do you have this problem, right? And there's
yes, I have that problem. No way.
Right. And so then we would say something like, okay, well, what is the current method in which you do that, right? And so we would kind of validate that this was an existing process that people had in place, and then we said something like, what if we built for you a solution that did X, Y, Z, right? That allowed you to search, track, and monitor, on your mobile phone, on your desktop, all these different things. And they were like, oh yeah, that would be amazing, right? It's just trying to get a lot of these proof points that the market existed.
So how many actually said that they want to buy it at the last question? What was sort of the conversion?
Right. So everybody says they want to buy it, but the problem is that you don't have a product yet, right? So
pre-order? Did they get some pre-orders?
Yeah. So we did have a lot of customers. So initially, what we did was we created essentially like a beta program, and we had a bunch of customers on our beta program. They were just kind of signing up for free and using the platform, so we could get a lot of data points out of that.
Would you suggest doing what you did, cold calling, and then talking to customers? I mean, if you had to do it again, versus I know a lot of folks here, they probably go through Google consumer surveys, and that's the way we do customer discovery. Would you always defer to talking to real customers?
In retrospect, definitely. I mean, I think part of it was that we were like 21 years old and we didn't really know what we were doing, and so like the reality is that we just needed to go off and really talk to customers and validate the problem. The other thing is like looking back retrospectively, like this is how we do new product discovery at FiscalNote now, right? Like we create. We run an entire product discovery process that starts with talking with actual customers and then trying to extract the problems that they're facing, and then trying to extract their pain points and creating personas. So really very textbook way of product management, but in the way we were doing it was just kind of like more like organic, I think, and more real when we were talking with the customers.
Hashtag Startup Grind at Tim T. Hwang. want to do a little bit gear shifting here. So we've hung out before, and you told me the story about when you had Jerry Yang come up to you. Jerry Yang, who is, by the way, is the founder of Yahoo, come up to Tim and introducing himself. And what did you say?
Well, this was at a pitch event, right? And so this is him and one of his kind of investment partners, I guess.
But you didn't know who he was.
Yeah, so I didn't know who he was. The problem was I think Yahoo was founded in like 94 or something. So I was 2 at the time.
He's like, I'm the founder of Yahoo. He's like, what's that?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah, maybe I should be connected a little bit more in the Valley, but we were in the Valley for like 3 months at the time. So that was pretty funny. I mean, it also kind of illustrates like just this kind of weird generational shift that's going on right now in the Valley. And I'm sure this makes a lot of you kind of feel a little old, but I genuinely don't remember things like Alta Vista or Lycos or whatever people were using back when before we were born. So.
So no, I just find that very fascinating because you know, I'm thinking from his point of view, and Jerry's like, he doesn't know who I am. This is awesome, right? Like instead of like having that stardom carrying him, then people, you know, it's like, I'll take your money versus like, I don't know who you are, and that maybe wanted him to invest in your company more. But he wasn't the lead. Like Mark Cuban was the lead investor, and then Jerry with AME Cloud Ventures, he was part of the syndicated fund, right?
Yeah. So. Okay. You know, the kind of progression of things, the way it happened was Mark jumped in. We got a deal done first, and then.
But the important part is like Mark is leading this round.
Right.
That's the important part here.
Right.
Okay, because if that didn't happen, would Jerry be approaching you guys? That's sort of the question.
Yeah. So it's
or
hard.
Steve or NEA for that matter, right?
It's hard to kind of get counterfactual on what would have happened because we were kind of in the middle of raising our round. So. I mean, conceivably, we could have gone with another venture firm or something, but I'm actually pretty glad that Mark was the first who came in because I think he, you know, has added significantly a lot of value to the company and to the stuff that we were working on.
Okay, I was reading your blog, by the way. I wasn't stalking you. I was just, you know, that's what I do for research. Actually, I was stalking you, but in your blog, you said, quote unquote, we iterated on our sales process as we watched our sales cycle dive down and our CAC ratio increase. We iterate on our hiring process and make sure that we were effectively growing the team in a thoughtful manner. So I had Joe Payne here as our guest a couple months ago. He's the CEO of Eloqua. He sold his company to Oracle for $1 billion. He's really big on this CAC ratio. So this really got my ears perking. The CAC ratio, is this one of the metrics that you closely look at for FiscalNote?
Yeah.
Okay, so explain what that is and how do you use that to you know, strategize for your startup?
Sure. So the CAC ratio is like the basis for. I mean, it's one of the core metrics for software as a service companies, right? So as a company, you think about a lot of different metrics. At our company, we think about annual recurring revenue, ARR. We think about the cost of customer acquisition. We think about churn, and then those numbers kind of create the foundation for, you know, certain metrics that you look at, right? So you can look at things like the long-term value of a customer, kind of, you know, vis-a-vis the cost of customer acquisition. So this entire thesis around software as a service is basically that you spend the money for the cost of customer acquisition now, and then you continue to get the subscription revenues over time. And as long as you can keep the churn numbers down and, you know, increase the amount of value you have for your customers, you can theoretically make an infinite amount of value for your customers. Although there's kind of some upper limit, right? So you want to create this ratio between the long-term value of your customers and then the amount that it takes to acquire that customer initially, right? So that's going to inform how much capital you need to raise. That's going to inform, you know, how efficient your sales process is. That's going to inform, you know, whether or not you're efficient as a business. So it's very important. You know, it's a metric that we look at our company in terms of thinking about whether or not we're capital efficient and you know, whether or not we're operating well as a company.
But your board is probably really keen on this CAC ratio, right? So, so for those, I mean, you guys, if you guys want to know a little bit more about this CAC ratio, go on to the Bessemer website, and they have this thing called CAC ratio. what it is basically is gross margin, revenue minus costs of goods sold, divided by your sales and marketing cost, right, by quarter. And so what they say is if the ratio is above or close to 1, then you are doing a great job. Reinvest your cash into growing your company. I'm assuming you guys are more than 1.
Yeah, we're definitely above 1.
More than 1, yeah.
I
By a
think it'd
long
be-
shot, probably like orders of magnitude, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
so I won't say the number, but it's hard to
Okay, sure.
get venture backed if you're not.
Okay.
in-
Okay, that's a good.
yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So, and then if they say that if your CAC ratio is lower than 0.3, you suck. Like it says literally, it says sales and marketing plan sucks. Need to change it. And then if the ratio is between 0.3 to 1, stick with your sales and marketing plan. Find other ways to make your startup leaner. So, do you advise like folks? I mean, we have startups here. They have revenue and they're investing money into sales and marketing. Do you advise them to look into their CAC ratio this early?
Yeah, so I think in software as a service, no, I don't think
For SaaS, I mean, for
right,
SaaS.
right.
Yeah.
So not just in SaaS, right? I mean, this is an interesting way of thinking about any business in the long run, right? Like, how much, for example, as a restaurant, are you willing to spend on the cost of customer acquisition, and then what is the long-term value of that customer over time? And then you can kind of conceivably come out with some number around, your cost of customer acquisition. So the amazing thing and the key kind of thing in software as a service and in software in general in that equation is that your gross margins are insanely high, right? So gross margins in software as a service companies are like 60, 70, 80%. And so because that's the case, your CAC ratio tends to be insanely high. And so it's an interesting way of thinking about the business. And so if you can't get your price points or you can't get your costs in line as a business, then it's not really, you're not a sustainable business in the long run, right? So it's important to think about those unit economics in the beginning.
So if there's a startup here that has a CAC ratio of more than 5, would you personally introduce them to Mark Cuban?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay, so you got that? You heard that? Look it up. It's really important. I wanted to go into the topic of angel investors. We've been talking about it, but I think that one of the biggest needs as for startups. Startup Grind, we've done tens of thousands of surveys, and the number one pain point for startups is obviously finding funding, right? So it's finding capital. But I always think that so in the past for Startup Grind, we've had Foundation DB, we've had Smart Things, we've had all these startups where no one's heard of, and people are like, how did you, and then they'll get bought out by by Apple or Samsung, and people are like, how did you even know that these guys were going to be big? Just like that's why you're here too. But one of the proxies that I would always look at is the branded angel. So how important is it for these startups here in DC? Because DC is not very high up on some of these angel investors, especially in New York and San Francisco. How important and how ways could they reach out to angel investors and attract like a Mark Cuban? Are there any secrets to that?
So I don't think there's any secrets. I honestly think that if you build a strong business from the core, you can really attract anybody in this day and age. That being said, I think for us, one of the great things that I really significantly thought about, and this goes back to an earlier question, is this concept of like where you're located as a company. So I've been thinking about this a lot and thinking about kind of like the cores of industry within a specific city, and then the kind of technology innovation that gets spun off of that. So, LA tends to have a bunch of companies in like this, like advertising, creative space. New York tends to have a bunch of companies in like this fintech space as a result of a bunch of ex-bankers. Boston, of course, has a bunch of like pharma and healthcare tech companies. DC, the business of Washington is law. It's government. It's this kind of governance of the country. Now the problem is that there hasn't really been a significant, massive movement in defining what DC looks like and what that ecosystem looks like. Now, there's been kind of some movement in like cybersecurity and whatnot, but and like the actual core governance of the country and the business of Washington, there really hasn't seen that much innovation. So, we've seen a little bit of movement in that kind of the civic tech space, and I think one of the things that we try and brand ourselves as like a very DC tech company because we are in this kind of in the business of Washington, right? So we service a lot of compliance folks, a lot of government affairs folks, a lot of attorneys that are out there. People joke that DC has the highest per capita number of attorneys in anywhere in the country, and conceivably anywhere in the world. So one of the things that I think being here in the DC area allows us to really do is kind of define ourselves in that broader ecosystem, not just in the tech space, but kind of in the broader ecosystem.
Hashtag Startup Grind. I know I keep on saying this, but I want you guys to really tweet out at Tim T. Hwang. I wanted to talk about culture. We have seriously 200 cities all over the world, chapters all over the world, and I would say that DC, with the Q&A session, people ask about culture so much. I don't know why, because in the Valley they don't talk about culture because it's like duh. It's like it's just what it is here. I mean in there, but here it seems like culture really needs to be taught. So like, do you guys have a culture in FiscalNote? What does that look like? Why is that important? And how is that important for the future for your company?
Yeah, so one of the first things that we did, when we were starting the company, just almost in parallel with product and sales, was defining our company culture, right? This is something that I thought was incredibly important from the very beginning. So Gerald and Jonathan, who are my co-founders, I'd actually known them for a very long time. Jonathan I've known since 4th grade, and Gerald I've known since 6th grade. So you could say we worked together for over a decade before we started the company, in some capacity. And we had a very strong friendship that kind of went into starting the company. And we felt very strongly that, number one, I mean, this was back when we were just 3 people. We said, look, no matter what happens to this company, we're going to stay incredibly great friends throughout the entire process. So that's the starting point, right? But beyond that, as you start to bring on more employees, you start to kind of try and operationalize certain things that you start doing, right? So we have a series of company values that we have in place that we try and operationalize as much as possible. So our first company value, for example, is level up, right? Very, very simple. But one of the things that we had a strong appreciation for when we were 21 years old and starting a company was, we consistently needed to drive our professional development at a very fast pace, right? So our professional development needed to be, the rate of our professional development needs to be faster than the rate of the company's growth. Because if we wanted to be, top-notch CEOs or top-notch CTOs, by the time the company got to a next stage, we had to commit ourselves to constant training, constant development, constant mentorship, so that we would get there, right? And so eventually that value that we have internally spreads out to all the new hires that we have in place, right? So, we were more willing to take chances on certain people that necessarily did not have the technical skills, but had a really strong sense of culture or sense of commitment to that culture. Other values that we have in place are things like, being aligned and transparent, right? So one of the things that I try and do consistently is drive super hyper transparency across the company. And it's, to a certain point where, certain executives at our company have come up to me and said, like, do you feel like we're being too transparent as a company, right? Are you sure you should have talked about that deal or anything like that?
So no, this is really good, this transparency. How do you guys do that? Is it like a Google Doc you share with everybody, and it has like, tell me how do you create this transparency?
Sure. So after every board meeting, every quarter, what I do is I sit down with the entire company and I actually forward the entire board and investor deck to them. And then I sit down slide by slide and go over the entire company strategy, expectations that we set to our investors and our board members, and then the expectations that we set for ourselves, right? Every week we have weekly executive team meetings, and so we'll take minutes from those executive team meetings and send it out to the entire company, right? Any challenges, issues, strategies that we're debating, everybody is privy to that information. Core metrics across the company, all shared across the company. Now, getting the metrics obviously is a challenge in and of itself, but what we do with the metrics, I mean, it's almost default at our company, right? You just share it, right? I mean, that's what you need to do, because I think one of the things that I very deeply feel is that execution should not be on the top level executives to really take ownership of. It's the individual people on the ground, talking with customers, building product, dealing with the everyday issues that that have the best knowledge and the expertise to be able to solve them, right? And the only way that they can solve those things is if they have a common sense of the strategy, the metrics, the operating plan that we have in place. And so, we spend, an inordinate amount of time just trying to push information constantly to the company, right? So, I mean, it's just another example of like just trying to build a very strong internal company culture, which I think is very distinct in the DC area. Not in the sense of like, in startup land, but I think in this sort of, when you compare it, side by side with like government, right? Where it's like everything is top down, information is segmented and siloed across multiple different people. There's almost zero transparency. Things move at like a glacial pace. And this is one of those things where as you get, from 20 people to 50 people to 100 people to 500 people, that you can consistently drive speed and agility and execution at a very high level.
Okay, I have probably a few more questions before we're going to open up Q&A. I know you guys are getting restless, and you guys can start asking questions because my questions are not that great. So let's talk about the future of FiscalNote. When are you guys going to go IPO? Okay, wait. No, this is always a good question. So, if you could name the perfect acquirer, who would it be? If someone really like forced you, because you guys are going to say, "Oh, we're not going to get acquired," but if you had to, who would it be?
Yeah, so I would probably say, I mean, it's kind of cliche, but I would really like, Google, right? And the reason why is less so around the name, and it's more around two things. The first thing is the values that we have in place, right? So the cultural values. I think if LexisNexis offered us, whatever amount of money that they would offer us, I don't think we would take it, right? Just because not
even for $1 billion.
Well, we could probably beat that number at some point.
Oh wow!
Right?
Okay. Wow.
But the thing is, I think it's very hard if you're mission driven to take an acquisition offer that you don't think is going to work, right? And I think if LexisNexis, this kind of behemoth of a company with tens of thousands of employees, instead of building a search engine, essentially has a couple hundred employees in Ohio sitting there categorizing documents, were to acquire us, I would probably go nuts, like operating within that environment. So that's one thing. The other thing is I think our mission, which is to like organize legal information, make it useful for people, really kind of really provide the information that people need to be successful with their jobs. I think that aligns hopefully with not necessarily Google, but just like the broader tech ecosystem within Silicon Valley. So a company like Google or whatever the case is, I think would be great. I'm sure there are a multitude.
What about IBM?
So we'd have to think about it, right? But again, it kind of goes into like which division, how is it going to be used, what is the culture of that group, what is the culture of the company, then we'd have to kind of sit there and think about all that. But acquisitions are I think, if you are mission driven, acquisitions aren't always about the money. It's about the mission that you're trying to bring to fruition, right? An acquisition should be a combination of your efforts, right? Where you have like this very big mission that we have in place, which is to like build the next generation of legal software. And is an acquisition of IBM going to allow us to buy IBM to be able to accelerate that vision, or is it just going to be a big hindrance, right? And so, I think that would be kind of the key question there.
The reason why I mentioned that is because you guys, we had talked about this before, but you guys are building out your own stack. You guys are like a technology company that's disrupting the legal, the law vertical. But you guys are building your own language and your own stack. Is that right? Yeah.
So the big thing about our company is that we basically built everything from the scrapers all the way up to the web application, right? So whether it's scraping the legislative information, the indexing all that information, applying the cutting edge, natural language processing or social network analysis to be able to come out with forecasts and all these different things. We're not building like an iPhone app, on top of like an existing data set, right? Like we are fundamentally building everything from the ground up, which I think is an exciting challenge, I think, from an engineering perspective, but also it's a hard one. But I think that's also one of the kind of defensible things that we've done in-house.
Okay, we're going to open up to Q&A. So I think we have time maybe for 2-3 questions.
It's sort of a basic question, but could you talk about maybe the top 2 challenges that you experienced while you were starting FiscalNote and how you overcame them, as well as could you clarify whether or not you're an engineer yourself, and if not, how you got about working with engineers to start FiscalNote? Thanks.
Yeah. So the number one challenge that every startup founder will tell you is that the biggest issue you face is always about talent, right? How are you going to hire the best talent? How are you going to retain the best talent? In my experience, I think one of the big blessings that we had was that I had a great group of friends that were very technically oriented, and so I had. I guess our first 3 employees were all engineers, software engineers that had worked in places like Sprint and NASA and Google, and so I think getting them on board initially was a little bit of a challenge, right? Getting them to leave NASA or getting them to leave Google is kind of a big ask. But I think once you show them the vision, that was kind of the big thing that we had to do, is try and kind of get them on board. It's also one of the reasons why I think we had such great success, I think, on the capital raising side. I do remember we spent a significant amount of time thinking about that. Another kind of big challenge that we thought about was the algorithm itself, right? So when we were first trying to come out with this forecasting algorithm, we spent a lot of time. I would say just weeks upon weeks trying to come out with this algorithm. And so this kind of feeds into your second question, but I did take a significant amount of computer science courses in college and had a couple experiences kind of working within that environment. That being said, I'm not the best software engineer. I don't claim to be the best software engineer. I haven't coded pretty much in 2 years now after starting this company. I do remember this one experience when we were trying to build out the first version of the algorithm. We ran the algorithm. We went out to dinner because it said the runtime would be like 2 hours. And then we came back from dinner, and then we realized, we looked at the runtime, and it was like 16 weeks or something, because we really did not think about like the way it would work. And so it was like a lot of these like very stupid mistakes you kind of like stumble through, I think, that allow us to really get the initial algorithm off the ground. After the capital raise, I think, again, the issues pretty much come down to 2 things, right? It's talent and culture. And so, like on my to-do list, I have 3 things that I look at every single day that I need to do, right? Number 1, I need to make sure that there's enough cash in the company to survive. Number 2, I need to make sure that we recruit and retain the best talent. And number 3, we have the best culture that we can possibly build. And so I think my job pretty much fundamentally goes down into those 3 things. And from the very beginning, I've always had challenges with all 3 things, and we'll probably continue to have challenges with all 3 things in the future.
Do we have anybody working from NASA? I was just trying to help you recruiting. Okay, you got a question?
Yes. Thanks so much for your talk. It's very informative. I wanted to ask you to talk about the transition from MVP to, from where it's like this focused niche all the way to your broad spectrum where you can pretty much offer your services to counsel at any agency, especially in an area where there's a lot of regulation and disclaimer and constraint. If you could talk a little bit about how you broaden with all those restrictions.
Yeah, so this is kind of like the initial process that we went off and tried to build, right? So initially, we built a product, we identified a customer, a target customer within the organization, which in our case was like a head of government affairs, head of general counsel, or whatever the case is. I think we were lucky in the sense that initially we did actually go off and call as many people as possible in multiple different industries to try and grab proof points. And so today we're operational in a variety of different industries, from pharmaceuticals to healthcare, energy, real estate, insurance, technology. Some of our biggest customers are here in Washington, like Planned Parenthood or NAACP, big in technology like Uber and Lyft, and on the healthcare side, companies like Allergan and Aetna. But in order for us to be able to get to that point, we really had to really drill down and solve that one problem within the organization. And that's actually, I think, the beautiful thing about the enterprise is that it's less so about the industry and it's more about kind of that individual role within the industry itself, right? So there's certainly kind of like verticalized industry applications that you could do, but our strategy from the very beginning was to take this horizontal, like industry agnostic, but role specific approach in terms of targeting the customer.
Okay, we got time for one more question. Janice.
Thank you for your talk. Question. Give us an example of how somebody would get the most out of using FiscalNote. Just give us an example. I mean, I get the theory, I get the idea. Give me an example.
Sure. So I guess this is something that we had an opportunity to talk about, but basically the way to think about FiscalNote is we are creating the next generation of legal software, right? So we aggregate legislation, regulations, and eventually we're going to start doing court cases here in the US and eventually around the world. We extract all that information, normalize the information, and then allow people to be able to get a better sense for what's going on in the regulatory environment at any given time, right? So classic example, which I think resonates really well with the tech industry, is the sort of ride-sharing industry, right? So ride-sharing, I mean, so much regulation, so much legislation going on right now. You have Uber and Lyft getting slammed left and right everywhere, from anything from insurance regulations to licensing to now there's this stuff around labor regulations or whatever the case is. And so imagine yourself inside of Uber's headquarters or Lyft's headquarters. And you're getting slammed left and right. You get slammed $7 million here one day. You get slammed. You get shut down in the state here. You get fined in the city here. And you're going essentially crazy, right? Because you're trying to follow all these different things. So what do, right? Well, naturally, you hire general counsel, right? I mean, that's your natural strategy of things, just like any other kind of major corporation. And then you start hiring a bunch of attorneys, a bunch of lobbyists, start going off and start pushing your advocacy, right? Start following the issues, start advocating for certain things. So again, this kind of goes back to the fundamental problem, which is you have analysts, right, that are sitting there, first-year associates, second-year associates, that would normally do this. But imagine if we came in at FiscalNote and we said, we can give you a platform, search ride-sharing on the platform right now, and we'll surface for you all the ride-sharing laws in the US at any given time. You can follow every single step of the process. Oh, and by the way, you can actually forecast with over 94% accuracy whether or not this bill is going to pass, right? And so basically, it's a game changer for lobbyists and for attorneys, because now you can channel the resources into the areas that you need, right? Whether it's on the lobbying side, litigation, general counsel, compliance, all the way through. You have this opportunity. Now, magnify this experience in financial services, where you have Dodd-Frank, or in healthcare, where you have ACA regulations coming out, or in energy with the new clean power plan that's coming out, or I mean, any major industry really, in retail or technology. There's a very specific use case, and so our challenge has always been less so on building the technology and more on taking this broad-based application of technology and creating use cases from all the major industries that I think would benefit from the platform.
Okay, so I have two last questions. Because I'm the interviewer, I can ask as many questions as I want, but two last questions. Talk about your biggest mistake and how you recovered from it, and I'll ask you the second one. So talk about your biggest mistake and how did you recover?
Sure. So the biggest mistake that we talk about at our company is our Series A process. For a whole host of reasons, the day before we were supposed to sign our Series A, the deal fell through, and I had kind of 6 weeks payroll in the bank. We were, on the edge. 15 employees on payroll. Now, the amazing thing to this day that I'm incredibly grateful for is that at that time period, at this critical juncture point, every single one of our employees actually gave up their pay for 2 months, which allowed us to extend our runway and go back and bounce back from what would have been kind of the end of the company. But kind of two main elements from that, right? So the biggest mistake from there is, number one, not keeping a closer eye on our finances, kind of banking on the fact that a capital raise would happen. And number two, I think, was kind of not picking the right capital partner from the very beginning, right? And I say capital partner, not venture capitalist, because at an early stage company, they are your partner in building the company, right? It's not just somebody who hands you a check. They're adding operational value, strategic value, industry value, and so from that perspective, you really have to think about them as like this partner that you have in place. So, as a first-time entrepreneur, I think it's hard to get a real appreciation, because especially when you're kind of dealing with a large number of these kind of large numbers in the millions and whatever, right? Like you start to get a little disaggregated from from what they actually mean. And I think that's a huge kind of red flag for early founders, because you kind of, what happens after you raise your first round of capital is you step back and you're like, oh, it's over, right? Like I can go back to doing whatever I was doing. But really, that's like when it begins, right? And so that's kind of I think one of the biggest learning, the learning kind of experience that we had in our company.
So one last question, and this is probably the most important question. You ready? Okay. Who is your favorite superhero and why?
Yeah, so I think most tech entrepreneurs will probably say somebody like Iron Man or whatever. I actually, kind of geeky at the very beginning, but I really like the Green Arrow. So the Green Arrow is actually not like this superhero. He's like a normal in the sense that he doesn't really have any like big superpowers or anything, right? But it's interesting because his main skills are like, first of all, he has a lot of money. So apart from that, there's that. But his main skills are that he has like a very strong passion for social causes. And so he actually becomes like a very strong politician throughout the series. But also, it's like a very gifted technical coder and everything, right? So uses kind of this like social conscious plus technical skills to be able to be like a big superhero.
So obviously you told me the answer because I emailed you and you gave it to me. And I didn't know who the Green Arrow was before, so I had to do a little bit of searching. And went to the store and found the Arrow first season, and there's the Startup Grind swag. So here we go. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Tim Hwang. Thanks for showing up here. All right.